So I would like to, next slide, please. I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Robert Winn. Dr. Winn and I have been doing many things throughout, making trouble throughout the country. And he's a very close friend and partner of the National Patient Advocate Foundation and the Patient Advocate Foundation. Dr. Winn is the director of the VCU Massey Comprehensive Cancer Center. And he's going to talk to us on advances in cancer treatment and the ongoing struggle for health equity. Thank you.
Gwen, thank you. And I want to thank the NPAF and Gwen, obviously you and the committee for putting what I think is a timely sort of event together. Let me start off by sort of saying that I'm not going to give you slides, but we are going to discuss a couple things. We're going to talk about the advances in cancers. I'm definitely going to talk about that. In fact, many of you might not know that as we look to why we are where we are, in part it is because of the base fundamental that science and the discovery sciences of basic sciences has led us to understanding cancer better and creating medicines. Interestingly enough, I figured that just to take a little trip back to history, so we talk about the advances and we put this in context, that up before the 1950s, before Watts and Crick and Rosalind Franklin discovered that there was a such thing called DNA, most of the research had been around, engineering and agriculture and really looking at the issue of matter and energy, right? How to split an atom to get energy, how to use steam to create a locomotive. But the most interesting thing about this was that 1950 was a major turning point. Why am I talking to you about this? I want to talk to you about this because we have to appreciate, as Angela would say, appreciate those things that have actually changed, that have impacted our lives. But we need to talk about the reality of the shortcomings of those advances. When people say to me, oh, well, so what has science done? Yeah, I mean, I shake my head. I'm like, well, that's how the heck you got a cell phone. That's why we can do FaceTime. Because a number of unsung heroes had a great idea that didn't give up on it. Well, in 1950, it became the very first time that human beings were able to understand the nature of the human cell. The interesting thing by understanding the nature of the human cell is that we then really got into this science of basic science. And the goal was to see that if we could understand the most basic element of the nature of the human cells, we would be able to understand, one, how to fight cancer, and two, even in the future, as they were thinking, how to come up with different interventions. 1971, that led us to understanding that you couldn't just have basic science without clinical, right? This is where we get the whole context of translation, right? That we've gone from understanding basic fundamental knowledge about the cell, and what he had to do, he had to translate that into clinical practice. 1971, the big idea was to actually have all of us throughout the country organize ourselves in a way where we took our best and brightest academic institutions that were focused on cancer at the time and the National Institutes of Health, the federal government, in a partnership, if you will, to drive better science. What's happened in that time? Well, let's be honest. We've come up with new technologies of how to diagnose cancer earlier. This is where you get the mammography from. This is where you get colorectal screenings from. That didn't happen. And in fact, we can earmark the time where these technologies come on, and then we can, in some cases, see improvements. But what I'm here to talk about is the other side of those things that technology also brought was, in some cases, the perception of choice that just wasn't there. And the reality is that in some cases, the science moved without even asking us, folks in the community, or even have an impact. 1971, I'll take nothing for with Nixon's war on cancer. I will take nothing away. Since 1971, I think they missed their mark. Many of you may know the story that when Ted Kennedy called this Nixon's war on cancer, that President Nixon and the scientists around him thought that by just understanding the science, we were going to be able to eradicate cancer by 1981. Well, I don't think we've eradicated cancer, but I think if one is being honest and one is being aware of the data, we'll come back to that, we've certainly made progress. In my lifetime, I've gone as a lung cancer focused doc. I've gone from having to give people the talk because the only thing we had was cisplatin. And prior to cisplatin, which is a chemotherapy, there wasn't really anything. And as such, most people were dying from lung cancer. Cisplatin comes along around 1962, and we made some modest improvements. But to be quite honest with you, by the time I was a young doc, cisplatin just wasn't cutting it. Not for many. In my lifetime, we now have immunotherapy, molecular targeted therapy. People with stage 4 cancer who used to come into the offices where we had to prepare for the talk are now giving the PEP talk. Instead of telling them, hey, have you gotten your life in order? You might want to visit your last sets of friends. You may want to actually go out and do that salmon fishing in Alaska. I've gone from that to the PEP talk. The PEP talk of we may have in our toolkit those miracle drugs that we couldn't dream about. That's true for breast cancer. It's true for many of the other cancers. And as we are on the edge or the beginning, I would say, of this new, hopefully, if it works out, way of screening for cancer and the multi-cancer early detection, if it works, we yet have another technology that could enable us to save lives. Now, let me talk about the good before I get into the real stuff, because the good is the following. Since 1990 to now, I'll use an example of African Americans. The cancer death gap between Blacks and whites has been reduced. Not eradicated, but reduced. Those are good things. But here's our reality. That as much as we have advanced in our scientific understanding of the basic elements of how a cell becomes a cancer, as we have advanced our knowledge in how to harness the basic understanding of biology to understand how to come up with interventions, these things that we call clinical trials, and new medicines, that is, creating a molecule that becomes a medicine. As we come up with new detections to pick up cancer earlier, we have also inadvertently increased disparities between certain groups. Now, I know that sounds interesting because you're like, Dr. Winn, on the one hand, you're telling me about these advances, but you're telling me that these advances, I think once I had heard someone said that the future is here. It is just unevenly distributed. And by the way, I want to let you know that I'm going to also let you know that while certainly race is in this context, a social construct, it's a real construct that keeps people from having access to care. Someone the other day got frustrated and said, oh my God, those people in these neighborhoods, don't they know? They don't know, because we don't usually tell them. And two, we believe that they have the same opportunities for advancements and enjoying the benefits of the science. Not true. I was with a friend and I was trying to give him an example, and we were in a really good restaurant. And this restaurant just had, an amazing menu. There were so many options, so many choices in this restaurant of good things that you could eat and combos that you could do. And I turned to him and I said, isn't this wonderful? And he said, yeah. But I go, have you seen the abbreviated menu? He said, no, I haven't seen that. Lunch menu. I showed him the lunch menu. Lunch menu is smaller. Then I said, well, have you seen the express menu? Express menu? No, I haven't seen that. Show them the express menu. There's a couple things on there, but in general, I mean, the express menu was not, in his opinion, very appetizing. He was like, yeah, they got a couple things, but this is all right. That's kind of what we do with our communities, particularly our communities, rural communities, and other communities that are at risk, is that we give them the express menu. And even when it's the express menu, it's always served with the same warmth, speed, efficiencies. And we say to them, you have a choice. I wondered about this issue about choice because as a person who loves science, and I've said it and will continue to say it, if loving science is wrong, I don't want to be right. But I have to tell you that over my arc as a passionate clinician scientist, I have clearly seen a divide. We ask patients and we ask for communities to sort of be partners with us. But it's interesting in being a partner when you've made some assumptions about the communities you're supposedly partnering with. An example. It still exists in the old literature that, for example, African Americans or people, rural people, don't want to participate in clinical trials. Stop. This one person told me, Doc, I don't want to be experimental. I said, hold up, wait a minute. Has anyone ever told you, sir, that the reality is that when you're on clinical trials in the context of cancer, that you're getting the standard of care plus? And by the way, that when you reach the end of the standard of care, whether it be chemo or what have you, the standard in the 21st century is to offer you a trial. We went on to say that with some of these trials and some of what we see is that if you looked at the literature, that even the people that were, quote, in the control group, not getting standard of care, wound up doing better than people who were out in some other areas who were not part of a trial, not because there was something magic about the trial other than the people, meaning that you had more eyes on you, more attention on you, and more people that when something went a little wrong, they were on top of it. When I got through talking, he nodded his head and said something to the extent of, well, why didn't they just say that? I think that's been a problem. While science has been advancing, we've done two, what I think, significant errors. The first is we even don't ask our communities to be part and partners frequently. We assume that they can for a myriad of reasons, none of which makes sense to me, by the way, coming from those neighborhoods, by the way. But the truth is, we don't ask. Nadine Barrett and others have a campaign now going that says, just ask first. It's like, I was telling someone, and I've been talking about this. I had an epiphany the other day, a couple months back, or maybe even a year and a half ago, about why this happens. And I likened it to my being in middle school, where I was simply assumed that I never asked anybody to dance, which is why I wasn't dancing. But because I assumed A, they were going to tell me no, or B, that they weren't going to do it anyways. And the second thing is, when we do ask, many of us in the health profession, we sound crazy. In retrospect, in middle school, when I did every now and again get up the courage to ask someone to go dance, I sounded crazy. I would, in fact, in retrospect, not only should they have told me no, but I would tell myself no. And yet that goes unchecked in science. When we talk about how do we make a decision with you, we talk about shared decision making, but to have shared decision making, there has to be a bilateral sense of respect and a bilingualism that results in my being able to translate, right, what we know are our protocols and et cetera, and to be able to understand from the perspective of where our communities are coming from, our patients coming from, where they hold value. I remember once, and I've told this story, where I was in Chicago, South Side, and I was 14th Ward with Alderman Thompson. She brought me to a town hall meeting, and ultimately someone said, one of my scientists, is unfortunate, said, well, what he said was, in front of 200 people, was that they were all scientifically illiterate. We were reminded by one of the women that was in the audience, she was, shoveled away there. She was 80 plus. And she reminded us that while they, as she put it, may be scientifically illiterate, that we were illiterate too. I think Gwen said it best. We do a lot of studying on our communities, but not learning with our communities to be able to even help refine our scientific questions, because we are full of the fact that science has done all these wonderful things, but science has not done what it set out to do in 1971, which is to eradicate cancer by 1981, because there are things beyond the science that matter. By the way, there is a science to outreach and engagement. There is a science of communication. And where I think I'm pushing more people now is to understand that we have to be not only aware, but diligent in working towards figuring out how on all sides we can be more facile in the bilingualism that is necessary for science. And the courage, and I mean this, to not assume that someone's going to say no or that someone's not capable. We've made tremendous advances. The truth of the matter is, I now can have a person with stage 4 cancer come into my office, and my immediate thought isn't, oh, poor person. Now, we still have our struggles. Brain cancer, pancreatic cancer. But Dr. Sharpless, who's the head of the NCI, recounted a story for me recently that really touched me. It was about his father. He essentially said that had my father been around post 2010, he would have gotten the standard of what is now therapy for melanoma and would have survived. That therapy came out of the understanding of clinical trials. This is the head of our NCI in North Carolina. Dr. Sharpless reminded me that there are many things that we take for granted, but we take for granted. And that turns out it's not just that we take it for granted, but our taking it for granted may cause people their lives in our communities who don't understand what the science is and what the science can do. I'll end with a couple things. I was recently just in an Uber, like literally like, a few weeks. I mean, I don't know. Anyways, I was in San Diego. I'm back in San Diego now, by the way. In San Diego, had a guy who picked me up in an Uber who essentially said to me, hey, I think, that you guys are holding out on us. What do you mean? He says, I think you're making money off us because you have the cure for cancer. I stopped, paused, and said, oh my God, how did you know? You should have seen the look on his face. He turned around and he says, I knew it. And I said, yeah, but here's a modification. it's not that we're hiding it, we're just hiding it in plain sight. Those who can get to the institutions that have brought forth the science, then translate it in a way that makes it accessible, those patients with lung cancer and breast cancer and others live. And those who don't. That discussion led me to one quick thing that has become a mantra, at least for me, that all the great science in the world certainly is doing some good and is absolutely necessary for us not to always look to Dr. TikTok and Dr. Google for the answers, because remember, Dr. TikTok and Dr. Google, that's a place where you start, but that place doesn't see you. That's an amalgamation of artificial intelligence actually putting, so it's interesting that we talk out of both our mouths about the theories of artificial intelligence and people looking at us and all the rest of this crazy stuff. And we're looking at Dr. TikTok and I don't believe my doctor. But the truth of the matter is, the nice thing about health systems that they're right is that they see you. Our job is to not only to hopefully get them to see you, but to hear you. And I think there are enough of us that are committed to this new approach, the courage to have at least a little bit of humility as we are learning with and from our communities how to refine our own science. Believe it or not, it's starting to get some traction. That's what I'm most excited about. I actually think that as crazy as things seem around us, and as frustrating as things are, that we are starting to think about how to do things in a different manner. And that brings me great hope. I hope you share my excitement that we certainly have made advances, but I hope you also share in my excitement that I'm looking to you all of how we can be much more effective at bridging our science to our communities. And with that, I want to say thank you. And Gwen, I think I will give the floor back to you.